By the time we understood what this meant, it was already too late. There's a weapon in someone's hand. Not unusual, not in this world. What's unusual is the pause, the breath before the decision, the moments where survival and something older, something softer, hang in the balance together. The Walking Dead keeps returning to this moment, season after season, character after character. The show places someone at the crossroads of mercy and ruthlessness, and then quietly shows you what comes next. I've spent a long time in the archives of this story, rewatching, reading interviews, following a thread most people walk straight past because they're watching for the next death, the next villain, the next twist. But this thread runs underneath everything. And the question it leads to, the one I keep returning to quietly, is this. What if mercy is the thing this world was designed to punish? The church is quiet. That's the first thing worth noticing. Not the violence, not the aftermath, but the particular silence of the space before it happens. Afternoon light through dirty windows, old wood and still air, the kind of room that was built specifically for forgiveness, where people came to confess the things they'd done and be told they were still worth something. It's the third episode of season 5, and Rick Grimes is standing inside that room with a red-handled machete and a promise he made to someone who is now on his knees. Gareth and the Terminus survivors are cornered. The ambush fell apart the moment Rick's group came back through those doors. They're outnumbered, outgunned, in a position that has no good ending for them. And Rick has a choice, the same choice that The Walking Dead has been placing in front of its characters since the very first season, over and over again, in different rooms and different light, and with different weapons in different hands. He doesn't lower it. No appeal to humanity, no offer of survival in exchange for surrender. He had told Gareth earlier that he'd use this specific machete on him, a promise of the brutal kind, the kind people make when they're past negotiating. And now, in a church, he keeps it. His group watches, nobody moves to stop it, nobody looks away, and nobody who witnesses it seems to be waiting for Rick to step back, to find another way, to be the man he might have been before all of this started. Here's the part I keep coming back to. The episode doesn't frame this as tragedy. There's no lingering camera on Rick's hands afterward, no scene of someone quietly crying for what the group is becoming. There's a grim finality to it, a settling. And then the story moves on. The threat is neutralized. The group is safer. Gareth had been hunting them, intending to eat them. The math is clean, if nothing else is. Michonne was there. Sasha was there. Abraham, who has done violent and terrible things of his own, was there. None of them object, because by this point in the story, they've all absorbed something that took several seasons to understand. This world has a grammar, and mercy is not part of its vocabulary. Now, I want to name something clearly before we go any further. I'm not arguing the show glorifies violence. I'm not saying the writers want you to walk away thinking ruthlessness is admirable. What I'm saying is something more specific, and I think more interesting. The show is structured so that ruthlessness works. It consistently rewards the hard choice made without hesitation. It consistently costs the people who pause, who hope, who choose to believe the world might still have room for something gentler. Whether that's a deliberate thesis or an emergent pattern, something that accumulated across 13 seasons without anyone consciously deciding on it, is exactly what we're here to figure out. Because once you see it, you really can't stop. Just a quick one before we get back into the analysis. If you're enjoying the content so far, be sure to leave a like and sub down below. Think about what happens in this show when someone lowers the weapon. When someone pauses at the exact moment, the narrative seems to be asking them not to. Herschel Green spends the better part of season 2 holding on to the idea that the walkers might still be reachable, keeping them in his barn, choosing hope over pragmatism, refusing the harder truth his own farm was sitting right on top of. Morgan Jones, returning in season 6, has rebuilt himself entirely around non-violence, his staff instead of a gun. All life is precious, repeated like a prayer, carried across the country into Alexandria like something fragile he's terrified of letting fall. He is written with genuine warmth, real complexity, deep moral seriousness, and the show spends 3 seasons proving him wrong. Not cruelly, not dismissively, with care, with respect, with full acknowledgement of why he chose what he chose. But wrong nonetheless. The world doesn't meet him halfway. It takes someone he loves. It costs something he can't get back. And the philosophy, eventually, doesn't survive what the show does to it. This is the pattern I've been tracing through the archive. Not villains getting what they deserve. Not fools learning hard lessons. Good, thoughtful, morally serious people choosing restraint, choosing compassion, choosing to believe there's another way, and being quietly, methodically shown that there isn't. Is that a habit, an accident of narrative gravity, or is there something more intentional underneath? A quiet argument about what survival costs, about what protection requires, about the price of keeping people alive in a world that stopped valuing that. I don't know yet. That's why we're here. Before we follow the thread any further, I want to plant one name. Just one. We'll come back to it properly soon, but for now, I want it sitting quietly in the back of your mind, doing what it does. Shane Walsh, file it away, we'll need it. Shane Walsh is the most uncomfortable character this show ever created. Not because he's a villain. He's not really. Or at least not in the way the show initially wants you to think he is. He's uncomfortable because he's right. Not completely. Not about everything. But about the thing that matters most in the world the show built. He is right before anyone else has the courage to be. Let's go back to season 2, episode 3. Otis is a good man. The show establishes this clearly even before we understand what's about to happen. He accidentally shot Carl. Yes, a horrifying accident, the kind that hollows a person out. But he stayed. He didn't run. He went with Shane toward the high school, through crowds of walkers, into a building that was already lost, to get the medical supplies that might save that child's life. He is heavy, slow, scared, and he goes anyway. That's not the behaviour of a bad person. Shane shoots Otis in the leg, takes the supplies, leaves him there. Carl lives. The show frames this as monstrous, and in the immediate moment, it is. We watch Shane come back with a haunted look and a story that doesn't quite add up, and we're meant to feel the wrongness of it radiating off him. We're meant to look at Rick and understand, without it being said, that Rick would never do what Shane just did. That's the gap the show needs us to see in those early seasons, the distance between these two men, the line Shane has crossed that Rick hasn't. But here's what the archive keeps reminding me. A few seasons later, Rick does do what Shane did. Not identically, not with exactly the same calculation, but the same core logic. Hard choice, No hesitation. One life over another. The math of survival made explicit. Rick becomes Shane. The show just waits until we love Rick enough that when it happens, we understand instead of recoil. And that arc, from recoil to understanding, might be the most honest thing this show has ever done. Shane saw the world clearly before anyone else in the group was ready to see it. He understood, perhaps in that first week outside Atlanta, that the old rules had genuinely stopped applying. That survival wasn't going to be polite. That mercy, extended to the wrong person at the wrong moment, was just a slower way of dying. He said as much to Rick more than once in the arguments that felt like they were about Laurie or authority or the farm, but were really about something deeper. Whether the world they were living in was still continuous with the world they came from. Shane believed it wasn't. Rick believed, for a long time, that it was. And the show kept them in conflict just long enough to prove that Shane's reading was closer to correct, before removing him, before transferring that knowledge to Rick, like a relay baton passed at the cost of the first runner's life. He was punished for being right too early. That's the quiet tragedy of his arc. He arrived at the destination before the story was ready to let the audience follow him there. He had to become something more obviously threatening, had to be made into a clear enough danger that Rick's response would feel justified rather than monstrous, because the show needed to execute the man who understood the thesis before the thesis was ready to be acknowledged. His death in Season 2, Episode 12, is staged with extraordinary care. Rick is the one who does it. Carl is the one who stops the turn. But what the scene is really doing, what I think it was always doing, is the show passing Shane's knowledge to Rick in the most expensive transfer imaginable. Shane sees clearly. He dies for it. Rick inherits the clarity, and then survives. I keep thinking about Laurie in all of this, because Laurie watches Rick change, watches him absorb what Shane was trying to teach, and somewhere in the process, something shifts for her too. There's a conversation she has with Rick in Season 2, where she tells him that the things Shane did, the things he's capable of, might be what they need. She says it quietly, like someone confessing something, like she already knows where this road ends and has made a reluctant peace with the direction of travel. From Laurie's perspective, the question might never have been whether ruthlessness is right. It might have been which man she trusted to carry it without losing everything else in the process. Shane was right. He just wasn't the right man, and the show never quite forgives itself for needing that to be true. Morgan Jones is standing somewhere in Season 6, staff in hand, watching a conflict he has decided, at the level of identity, not to join. He has the philosophy down by now, the language of it, the internal architecture that makes all life is precious into something he can actually live inside rather than merely believe. His staff instead of a gun, de-escalation instead of execution. The radical possibility that redemption is available to almost everyone, if you're willing to do the patient, dangerous, uncertain work of offering it. He built this after we lost him. After Season 3's Clear, where we found him again, barricaded in his hometown, alone, with traps covering every surface and writing covering every wall. That man was not at peace, That man had lowered the weapon at the wrong moment, tried to spare the life of the walker, who then killed his son Dwayne, and had been carrying that specific mercy like a stone in his chest for years. What he built afterward, the Aikido, The philosophy, the deliberate and practiced refusal to kill, wasn't strength, it was recovery. A story he told himself so he could survive his own survival. I want to hold that image for a moment. Morgan's staff. Not because it's a weapon, though it is, but because of what it represents in contrast to the lowered gun, the lowered machete, the lowered fist. He chose the staff specifically because it's a defensive instrument, a tool for stopping, for redirecting, for creating space rather than ending possibility, not for finishing things. For several seasons, the show treats this choice with care. It doesn't mock Morgan. It doesn't use him as a punchline. It gives him room to be genuinely compelling, to articulate his worldview in ways that resonate, to save lives through restraint, as well as occasionally lose them, to represent something the show needs in its moral ecosystem, even if it seems unable to protect that thing from the world it's built. In Season 6, his philosophy creates real consequences when it intersects with an early savior encounter. His decision to spare a particular life sets off a chain of effects he can't contain or control. But the thing I find most significant isn't when Morgan's mercy fails, it's the silence after. When Morgan finally kills again, and he does in Season 7, when every alternative has been stripped away, he doesn't make a speech. He doesn't announce that he was wrong, or that the world has corrected him, or that he's arrived at a new understanding of what survival requires. He just does it. The moment is almost quiet, one choice, made without ceremony, and the philosophy he carried for seasons simply stops being something he can hold. What he doesn't say in that moment is the entire point. He doesn't apologize. He doesn't explain himself. He doesn't look for acknowledgement from the people around him, or seek absolution, or try to frame the act inside a larger argument. The staff is still in his hand, but it means something different now. It meant protection once, restraint, the possibility of a gentler grammar. Now it just means he hasn't picked up a gun yet. The distance between those two things is enormous, and the show marks it with silence, which is the most honest way it knows. And that, the quiet after the choice, the absence where the philosophy used to be, is what Act 1 has been building toward. Not whether these characters are good or bad, because they're clearly both, at different moments, in different lights. The question is structural, almost mechanical, in the way it plays out across season after season. Does The Walking Dead believe that ruthlessness is the price of survival? That the world it depicts is designed, at the level of story logic, to punish the people who try to hold on to something gentler? Or, and this is the possibility I most want to sit with, does the show know exactly what it's doing? And is it asking you quietly to feel something about that? Not agree with it, not endorse it, just feel it. Feel the cost of a world where the merciful keep paying more than they should have to, and feel what that means about the kind of world we're watching. The pattern exists. I'm sure of that now, after everything I've found in the archive. What it means is something we're going to have to figure out together. Before we start laying out evidence, before we trace the pattern forward through the full arc of this story, I want to spend some time with a character. Just one for a moment. Not as a data point, not as an example to deploy in the argument, but as a person. Someone the show built with extraordinary care, whose arc I think tells you more about what this series believes than any official commentary ever could. Her name is Carol Pelletier, And she might be the most important character The Walking Dead ever wrote. Not the most powerful, not the most tragic, not even the most morally complex, though she's genuinely all of those things, the most important. Because Carol is, I've come to believe, the show's thesis character. The one the writers built the argument through, season by season, almost without stating what they were doing. The one whose transformation, traced from the very beginning to wherever we find her now, reveals the shape of the whole story's moral architecture. We meet Carol in season 1 as a woman defined by her smallness, not her physical presence, her emotional footprint. She defers, she flinches, she apologizes for her own existence in rooms she has every right to inhabit. Her husband Ed is a controlling, violent man, and Carol has spent years arranging herself around him, making herself less so. There's more room for his need to dominate. She's extraordinarily good at it. It is the skill she has developed in place of all the others she never got to have. Then Ed dies and something begins, very slowly, to shift. It doesn't happen fast. Carol's transformation is one of the most carefully written character arcs in the entire franchise. The show doesn't rush it. It lets her find her footing slowly, lets her discover what she's capable of in increments, lets her build the woman she becomes out of the wreckage of who she was. By season 4, we arrive at the moment that I think defines everything that comes after. In the first episode of that season, Carol walks into the prison's sick block alone and kills Karen and David, 2 members of their own community who have come down with a dangerous flu. She burns the bodies. She does this without consulting Rick, without a group vote, without telling anyone what she's done until Rick traces the evidence back to her. She does it in secret, in the dark, with the decision already made before anyone else had the chance to make it alongside her. The lowered weapon, in Carol's case, is the one she picks up before anyone thinks to hand her one. What's remarkable about this moment is what Carol is not in that scene. She's not cruel. She's not detached. She is, if you look at her face, the most controlled and deliberate version of herself that we've seen up to this point in the series. This is not a woman in the grip of fear or rage or grief run sideways. This is a woman who looked at the math of what survival required, understood it completely, and acted alone. Without asking for permission she knew would never be unanimously given in time. The show kicks her out of the prison for it. Rick tells her to leave, and for a moment the narrative seems to be agreeing with the community's horror, seems to be placing a moral judgment on Carol's choice, saying yes, there is a line and she crossed it. But then season 4 keeps going. The flu spreads. People die. Herschel works himself to exhaustion, keeping the sick alive. And when we find Carol again, out on the road, in a house with a dying man and 2 little girls who have no framework for what the world has become, we find someone the show clearly respects. Deeply, quietly, almost mournfully respects. Because she was right. That's the truth the show can't quite say out loud, but keeps showing anyway, in the quiet between the lines. Did Carol choose ruthlessness? Or did the show need her to choose it, so it could argue through her arc, across seasons, across losses, across the version of herself she keeps reinventing, that the choice is not a betrayal of who you are, but a more honest version of what survival actually looks like from the inside? I'm not sure those 2 things are different. And that ambiguity, I think, is the point. Which brings me, inevitably, uncomfortably, to Negan. I am going to beat the holy hell out of one of you. Season 7, Episode 1. Negan Smith stands over a line of survivors on their knees, in the dark barbed wire bat resting on his shoulder, like something that's been there so long it's become part of him. He's delivered some version of this speech before. You can hear it in the rhythm, the practiced pauses, the way his eyes move across each face, reading fear, calibrating pressure. He knows how this works. He knows precisely how much terror he needs and exactly how to produce it. He never lowers the weapon, not here, not in any moment that counts. And Negan survives. Through wars, betrayals, years of imprisonment, and a whole new world being constructed around, and sometimes without him, Negan survives. More than that, he remains, in some strange and troubling way, one of the most influential people in every room he enters. His ideas outlast his power. His logic keeps being proven, if not right, then at least functional. The uncomfortable truth about Negan's arc, the thing I think the show most wants you to sit with and not resolve too quickly, is that his system worked. The saviors were brutal and dehumanizing, yes. They turned people into resources, organized communities around fear and tribute, stripped dignity from every interaction. But they were also, and this is the part that's easy to skip past, stable. Communities under Negan's protection didn't get wiped out by external threats. They paid their tribute and they survived. In a world where survival is not a given, where it's the only real currency, that's not nothing. Alexandria, by contrast, built on Rick's model of conditional mercy, rehabilitation. The belief that human goodness persists falls apart repeatedly. The walls come down, leadership fractures. People die who might not have died under a more ruthless system. The show never quite lets you forget this. Every time Alexandria faces crisis, Negan's logic echoes somewhere in the background, unspoken but present, like a frequency you can feel even when you can't hear it clearly. His rules work. That's the disturbing part. And the show, to its credit, refuses to let you look away from it. I think about this in the context of Rick watching Negan. There's a quality to Season 8 where Rick, mid-war, is doing things that would have been unrecognisable to the man he was in Seasons 1 or 2, or even 3. Organising strikes, making hard calls, treating people as tactical elements, and in certain moments you can see, or I think you can see, that Rick recognises something in Negan that he'd rather not name. They are not the same man, but they are operating on increasingly similar logic, increasingly similar calculations, and the distance between them has narrowed in ways that the show doesn't try to hide. Negan himself acknowledges this. In his conversations with Carl across Seasons 7 and 8, those strange, almost gentle exchanges where Negan shows Carl his community, explains his rules, seems to genuinely want to be understood. He says in different ways across different scenes that Rick's world is worth saving. He just doesn't believe Rick's methods are capable of saving it. He thinks Rick is still operating with one hand tied behind his back, still extending mercy the world isn't structured to absorb. What does it mean that the show lets Negan live? That it eventually pivots toward his usefulness, his evolution, his complicated re-entry into the human community? Some fans read this as endorsement, the show letting the ruthless man win, survive, eventually matter. Others read it as something more nuanced. Ruthlessness, even at its most effective, is ultimately a dead end that brings you back around to needing other people, needing connection, needing to be seen as something more than the weapon you carry. Both readings make sense to me, and I think the show has earned the right to mean both things at once. From Rick's perspective, watching Negan across the war and everything that comes after, the recognition is quiet and uncomfortable. The look of someone seeing an argument they haven't yet found a way to answer. From Negan's side, watching Rick, he sees someone who kept lowering the weapon in the moments it mattered most, and maybe, in the privacy of whatever's left of his inner life, something in that costs him. There's a moment in Season 4, Episode 16, the finale of a season that had already pushed Rick further than any previous one, where a man named Joe has Rick by the throat, in the road, in the dark. Joe leads the Claimers, a group organised entirely around simple and brutal rules. You claim it, it's yours. No appeals, no exceptions, no mercy extended in either direction. And Rick is on his knees with the people he loves, within arm's reach and nothing in his hand. He bites out Joe's throat, not metaphorically, not as a last resort weapon retrieved. He uses his teeth, and the fight is over. I've rewatched this scene more times than is probably healthy, and what strikes me most isn't the violence itself, it's the silence that follows it. Rick breathing in the road, Carl watching from a few feet away, Michonne watching, everyone watching, and the expression on Rick's face in those first seconds after, not horror, not triumph, not guilt, something more like recognition, like a man who has found the bottom of himself and discovered it's further down than he knew, but solid, reliable. The world puts him on his knees with no weapon, and he dismantled the threat with his own body. That's not desperation, that's a decision. The speech Rick gives in the Season 5 finale is the clearest articulation of his philosophy the show ever provides. We are the ones who live, he says. And the line doesn't sound like hope exactly. It sounds like a dare, like someone who has been to the edge so many times that surviving has stopped feeling like luck and started feeling like a choice he keeps making consciously. The weapon, whatever form it takes, machete or throat, or the threat of what he's willing to become, is never fully lowered. It just rests. Every time Rick crosses a line in this show, the narrative rewards him with survival. Not happiness. The show is scrupulous about this. Not peace, not the domestic calm he keeps reaching for and never quite touching, but survival. The people behind him remain alive. The community holds. The next threat is met and overcome. The pattern is consistent enough, across enough seasons and enough line crossings that it stops feeling like narrative coincidence and starts feeling like argument. I want to be fair to Rick's emotional arc because it's more complex than any thesis can fully contain. He doesn't enjoy the crossings. Each one removes something he can't get back, some version of himself, some quality of certainty about who he is, some capacity for the kind of trust that doesn't cost anything. The man who bit Joe's throat is not the same man who drove into Atlanta in Season 1, looking for his family in a city that had already burned. That man is still in there, somewhere, looking out through different eyes, but he's been layered over, sealed beneath by everything survival required him to do and become. And Carl sees it. That's the detail, I keep coming back to. Carl is there in the road watching, and Carl's face in that moment isn't quite horror. It's something more complicated. It's the expression of someone watching their own future unfold in real time. Someone who is young enough that the future still feels like a choice, but old enough to understand what the alternative costs. Carl will spend the seasons that follow trying to hold on to the belief that people can be better than the worst thing they've ever done. That mercy, properly directed toward the right person at the right time, is worth something. That the world his father's methods are protecting can eventually become a world those methods are no longer necessary in. He dies in season 8 still holding that belief. The show gives him that grace at least, lets him be right about the destination, even if the road he walked died with him. But after the road, after the throat, after the silence settles, Rick doesn't say anything. He doesn't explain himself, or reach for the man he used to be, or offer anyone watching an interpretation of what just happened. He just breathes. And in this story, that silence holds more weight than most speeches. Let me tell you about 3 people the show built and then couldn't protect. Dale Horvath is the first. He's there from the beginning. The RV, the highway, the moral voice that nobody asked for, and everybody quietly needed. Dale is the character the show uses in those early seasons to articulate the case for humanity. He believes people are still people. He believes that how you treat the most dangerous among you defines you just as much as how you treat the safest. In season 2, when the group debates what to do with Randall, a stranger, a potential threat, a young man whose presence is a liability and whose death would resolve the immediate problem cleanly, Dale is the one who goes around the room, one by one, trying to make the argument that execution is wrong, that they haven't become something that does that there's still a line, still a there if they choose to keep it. He fails to persuade them. He goes out into the field that same night and is found by a walker he didn't hear coming, and he dies before morning. The timing has always felt deliberate to me, not cruel, not punitive, but pointed. The show does not let Dale live to see what the group becomes. It removes him right at the moment when the argument he was making is losing, as if the story can't sustain both his presence and its own trajectory. He would keep making that argument. He would keep being right about what the crossing costs, even if not about whether it can be avoided. And the show needs room to move. Tyrese Williams arrives in season 3 and carries the same quality into harsher circumstances. Tyrese is a large, physically powerful man who could make himself frightening and consistently chooses not to. He refuses again and again to become the thing the world keeps trying to make him. Even after the death of Karen, his girlfriend, killed by Carol in that season 4 act we've already sat with, he eventually forgives, eventually lets the rage go, chooses to carry the grief instead. That's not weakness, that's a specific, deliberate, costly form of moral seriousness. In season 5, episode 9, Walking Through the Woods with Noah, Tyrese is bitten. The scene that follows, his mind filling with visions of the dead he carries, plays almost like a release. Like the show is granting him the only peace it knows how to give, the only form of protection from a world that was never going to let someone like him rest. He dies having never fully hardened. The lowered weapon is the last image of him that matters. His refusal, chosen again and again, all the way to the end, to pick it back up. And then there's Beth Green. Beth is perhaps the most interesting of these 3, because she is the one the show most explicitly associates with hope. She sings. She sees possibility in small things. In season 4, sheltering in an abandoned funeral home with Daryl, she talks about the future with a matter-of-factness that borders on radical in context. She has a quality the show treats as both beautiful and quietly fragile, a belief that there is still something worth reaching for, even now. She is taken to Grady Memorial Hospital. She tries to save people there, tries to negotiate freedom for herself and others, tries to work within a broken system to extract something human from it. And in the season 5 mid-season finale, after what looks like a peaceful exchange is arranged, she makes a last-second decision with a small pair of scissors, the most minimal possible weapon chosen at the worst possible moment, and is shot and killed. The scissors, the smallest weapon imaginable, the lowered weapon that wasn't quite lowered in time, that wasn't the right weapon, that wasn't enough. Dale, Tyrese, Beth, 3 characters built around compassion, hope, the refusal to fully surrender to what the world seems to require. 3 characters. The show mourns loudly, with tremendous care, in ways that linger long after the deaths themselves. Which raises the question I want you to carry into the next chapter. If the show was simply punishing them for being wrong, would it mourn them this much? Start making a different list in your head. The ones still standing: Daryl Dixon, Michonne Hawthorne, Carol Pelletier, Maggie Rhee from season 9 onward, and in his complicated and contested way, Negan. These are the survivors, still moving, still leading, still shaping whatever comes next by the time the original series ends and the spin-offs begin. And when you put them alongside the characters we just lost, Dale, Tyrese, Beth and others we'll get to, a pattern emerges that's genuinely difficult to dismiss or explain away as coincidence. Every person on this list crossed a hard line early. Not in a final season revelation, not in a late arc transformation, but early. Before the audience fully understood what the show was willing to let its characters become, and every single one of them survived the longest. Michonne's introduction in season 3's 6th episode is the version of this I return to most often in the archive. She walks out of morning fog with 2 armless, jawless walkers on chains, and a katana she's clearly been using for a long time. There's no hesitation in her movement, no uncertainty in her eyes. She has already done the math, already paid the price of understanding what the world requires, and what you're watching is not someone in the process of becoming hardened. It's someone who already is, and who has made a kind of functional peace with it. The katana is almost never lowered. That's the detail worth sitting with. She lowers it eventually, for Andrea briefly, for Rick, after a negotiation of trust that takes time and costs something, for her children, in ways that are completely different from the wartime readiness. But even in the softest, most human moments of her arc, the katana is within reach. The readiness never fully leaves. She hasn't surrendered the weapon. She's learned to hold it differently. And she survives everything. The governor, the saviors, the whisperers, the years in between. By the ones who live, she is still moving, still searching, still, in the most fundamental sense, refusing to stop. Daryl's version of this is quieter. He crosses his lines without announcement, without the philosophical framing Carol gives her choices, without Negan's performative certainty. Daryl just does what the moment requires, and doesn't discuss it afterward. The early seasons show him doing things that, in a different story, would position him as the threat. He operates on a survivalist's logic that predates the apocalypse, something learned from an upbringing that was its own kind of disaster, its own kind of world without reliable safety. He came into the end of civilization already knowing that safety was never guaranteed. But something in him remains, through all of it, a loyalty that is specific and fierce and non-negotiable. He is ruthless in service of something. The people he protects, the connections he refuses to abandon, even when abandoning them would be easier and safer. The show threads this needle carefully. Daryl can operate without hesitation and still remain legibly human, because his ruthlessness never becomes about the ruthlessness itself. Maggie's evolution is the most instructive, I think, because we watch it happen in continuous time. She begins the series as Herschel's daughter, his compassion, his faith, his mercy given a younger face, and a willingness to learn what the world is requiring. Then she loses Glenn. Then she loses her father's world. By season 11, making decisions about the Commonwealth and external threats, and the cost of leadership, she is someone her season 2 self would not have recognized. She doesn't enjoy it, you can see that clearly, but she doesn't flinch. She crossed the line. She survived. What I find most significant about this list is not that these characters are good or bad. They're clearly both, often simultaneously, in ways the show doesn't try to resolve. What's significant is the structural pattern around them. Survival in The Walking Dead doesn't appear to correlate with goodness. It doesn't reward the kind, the hopeful, or the faithful as such. It rewards, if the pattern is what I think it is, something more specific, something we're about to get closer to. The showrunner interviews have something useful to say about this, and I think what was actually said is worth looking at carefully. Scott Gimple, who served as showrunner for seasons 4 through 8, and has continued as executive producer of the broader franchise, has spoken in various interviews about the central tension he saw at the heart of the series. The question he returned to in different forms across different promotional cycles was essentially this: what does survival cost? Not just physically, emotionally, morally, in the deep architecture of who you are. What does it do to the person who makes it through? He described the show across several conversations as being fundamentally about the weight of choices, about characters who have to decide repeatedly and without the luxury of time or certainty what they're willing to sacrifice in order to protect what they love. And the important word in that framing, the one I keep returning to, is willing. Not what they're forced to do, not what the situation extracts from them, what they're willing to do. The agency matters. The ownership of the choice matters. The show seems to believe that how you inhabit your decision is as meaningful as the decision itself. Now, I want to be careful here, because showrunner interviews are not canon, and they don't resolve the ambiguity we've been sitting with. What a writer says they intended and what ends up on screen can diverge, and the most honest analysis of a story includes both the intent and the execution, without assuming they're identical. But there's something in the Whisperer's arc in seasons 9 and 10 that crystallizes the question more clearly than any interview could. The Whisperers are not a standard Walking Dead threat. They're not raiders, not warlords, not survivors organized around tribute and power like the Saviors. They're something philosophically distinct. People who have decided to abandon the project of human civilization entirely. They wear walker skin. They move with the herds. They've built a community, Alpha's community, around the principle that the strong survive and the weak are culled, without sentiment, without hesitation, without human feeling as a factor in any calculation. Alpha never lowers the weapon. It's almost definitional. She has organized her entire identity around the impossibility of doing so, and she keeps her people alive for what appears to be years. She is, within the terms of her own system, extraordinarily effective. The communities she threatens, Alexandria, Hilltop, the Kingdom, are larger, more complex, more resource-rich, and they are afraid of her. That fear is a real thing, based on real capability. What I think the Whisperer's arc is actually doing, beneath the surface horror, it's staging a direct confrontation between the show's two competing arguments. On one side, Alpha, ruthlessness taken to its logical extreme, all the way to the point where humanity itself is being shed as unnecessary weight. On the other, the communities she threatens, imperfect, fractious, expensive in their complexity, but still organized around the belief that being human means something, that the cost of that belief is worth paying. Alpha is killed by Negan, who uses her own methodology against her. It takes a ruthless person to stop a ruthless person. The show doesn't try to argue otherwise, and this is where I push the thought as far as it goes. Consider the walkers themselves. Pure instinct, no mercy, no hesitation, no weapons lowered because there are no weapons, just bodies moving toward warmth and sound and smell, endlessly, without the luxury of choice. They are the most consistent survivors in this universe. They were here before the communities and they will be here after. They never pause. They never extend something that can be used against them. They are, in the show's internal logic, the endpoint of one argument about what survival requires. Are they the thesis taken all the way to its conclusion, or the warning about where the thesis leads, if you follow it without remainder? I genuinely don't know, and I think the show may have decided, wisely, to leave that open. What I do know is that the Whisperers changed how I read the lowered weapon. It's no longer just about survival. It's about whether survival is worth having. If you survive it by becoming something that no longer feels the difference. Herschel Green lived longer than he should have, given what the show was building toward, and that's not a failure of the writing. It's almost the opposite. The show kept him alive because it needed him. Not as a tactical asset, not as a community resource, but narratively. It needed someone to carry the argument for mercy, for faith, for the possibility that survival didn't require you to stop being soft in the places that mattered most. He was a farmer, a veterinarian, a man of faith. He kept walkers in his barn in season 2 because he couldn't bring himself to accept that they were truly gone. He forgave Rick's group for what happened to the barn. He forgave a great deal across the seasons with the specific generosity of someone who has thought carefully about what forgiveness costs and decided it's still worth the price. He learned, slowly, with real pain, that the world had changed in ways that required different tools, but he never abandoned the core premise that people were worth saving, that medicine was worth practicing, that the small human acts of care and presence had survival value, even in a world that seemed designed to punish them. In season 4, Herschel is the one who walks through the prison's infected cell block with a surgical mask and an IV bag, moving from bed to bed, keeping dying people alive. He is old, he has one leg, he is genuinely at risk. He does it anyway, again and again, while the flu spreads and people turn in the night. It is one of the most quietly heroic things the show has ever depicted, not because it's dramatic, but because it's so steady, so chosen, so clearly the act of a man who has decided what he's for, in a world that keeps asking people to decide what they're willing to become. His death at the governor's hands in the mid-season finale of season 4 is the most devastating the show produced in its early run. Not primarily because it's shocking, though it is, because of what it removes from the story. Herschel was the exception to the pattern. The mercy-first character who survived long enough to become genuinely wise, who shaped the community around him in ways that lasted beyond him, who earned his place among the survivors not despite his compassion but through it. His presence was proof that the pattern wasn't absolute. And then it is. What comes after is significant. Herschel's watch is passed down. His memory is invoked again and again, by Glenn, by Maggie, by people who knew him and carry the shape of what he believed. The mercy outlives the man. It's a beautiful detail and a painful one. The show insisting that what he stood for mattered, even as the structure of the story keeps suggesting that what he stood for couldn't survive. And here is where I want to let both readings exist without forcing them into resolution. Reading 1. Herschel dies because the show's thesis is correct. Mercy is vulnerability in this world. The gentle are punished. His death is the argument landing cleanly and finally on the side of the pattern. Reading 2. Herschel dies and the show mourns him with more care than it mourns almost anyone else, which suggests the show knows what it's losing, knows what mercy costs, and is asking you to feel that cost not as a lesson, but as a wound. The mourning isn't a footnote, it's the entire point. If the show were simply endorsing ruthlessness, Herschel's death would feel inevitable in a clean way. Instead, it feels like the story injuring itself, like the writers had to do it because the logic of the world they built demanded it and hated having to. Maybe the show doesn't believe ruthlessness is right. Maybe it just knows that the world it built doesn't leave much room for being wrong about survival. And it's asking you, in the space between Herschel's death and the silence that follows, to mourn that fact alongside it. Both of those things can be true at once. I think they might have to be. Herschel's watch keeps ticking. Even now in every spin-off, every new community, every character who invokes his name as a reason to try the harder thing. If the pattern holds, if the show does, structurally, reward the ruthless and cost the merciful, then what does that mean for the characters whose arcs are still being written, whose stories are still unfolding in spin-offs and sequels, and whatever the franchise becomes next? Daryl Dixon is, at this moment, the character this question hangs on most heavily. By the time his spin-off begins in France, somewhere after the end of the original series, after years of searching and waiting and the specific loneliness of someone who has survived everything but isn't sure what he's surviving for, he is a man who has spent more time operating alone than almost anyone else in this franchise. Not isolated exactly, but solitary. Moving through the world on instincts that have been sharpened by a decade of surviving things that should have killed him. In France, among people who don't know his history, in a landscape that doesn't owe him anything, those instincts don't soften. They do what they've always done. Keep him effective, keep him moving, keep the people around him, tentatively, alive. The lowered weapon, in Daryl's case, is the thing he keeps picking back up, even when you can see him wanting not to. There's a weariness to his arc that the show has always been honest about. He doesn't choose the ruthlessness. He doesn't enjoy it or perform it or organise his identity around it the way Negan does. He simply never found a version of the world that let him put it down for good. Every time he lowers the weapon, something forces his hand back up, and at some point, somewhere between season 3 and wherever France puts him, he stopped being surprised by that. But Daryl has always been more than the pattern, and I think the spin-off is genuinely interested in testing that. The France setting isn't incidental. It's a world that has had its own survivors, its own failures, its own versions of the same questions about what survival requires and what it costs. Encountering those different versions forces Daryl to examine his own answers in ways that are harder to avoid when you're not surrounded by people who share your history. He has to explain himself in a language he doesn't fully speak to people who have no reason to trust him. He has to figure out what he stands for when the shorthand of shared experience is gone. Can a character be ruthless and retain their soul in this universe? The show has never answered this cleanly. It's offered versions of yes, Carol, who cycles through darkness and something like Grace repeatedly, Michonne, who never loses her love for her children even at her most lethal, Maggie, who makes hard decisions and keeps the grief of them visible, and versions of No, the governor, who crosses so completely that no version of himself survives it, Alpha, who shed her humanity as a survival strategy and became something the show finally has to present as monstrous, not just effective. Daryl lives somewhere in that middle space. The show seems genuinely invested in whether he can stay there. Maybe the franchise is evolving its thesis in the spin-offs. That's a possibility worth taking seriously, rather than dismissing. The Ones Who Live was explicitly about the survival of hope, about Rick and Michonne fighting across years of separation to return to each other and to something worth calling a life. It's the most optimistic the franchise has ever been about what survives alongside the people who survive. Dead City is examining what Maggie and Negan's complicated, wary, mutually suspicious alliance means. A mercy-shaped person and a ruthless-shaped person learning to operate in the same space without destroying each other. Maybe the argument is being revised, made more nuanced, given room to breathe. Or maybe the pattern is simply being expressed more consciously now, with characters who understand what they are, who carry the cost of their own ruthlessness, with open eyes, who have chosen the weapon deliberately and know what holding it means and what it's for. I keep returning to the opening image, the pause before the decision. The weapon in the hand, mid-air between raised and lowered, between the choice and its consequence. Daryl in France carrying everything he's ever been, standing at that crossroads one more time. Does he lower it? Here is the counter theory, and I want to give it real room, more than a footnote, more than a caveat, because I think it might be the more honest argument, the one that sits more comfortably with everything this show has made me feel, across all these seasons, in all these late-night rewatch sessions. What if the show doesn't reward ruthlessness? What if it rewards something adjacent, something that looks like ruthlessness from a certain angle, but is genuinely distinct from it in ways that matter enormously? What if it rewards conviction? Look at Maggie's leadership arc in season 11. This is Maggie at her most commanding, negotiating with and around the Commonwealth, making decisions about when to fight, when to yield, when to sacrifice tactical position for something less immediately measurable. She makes choices that are hard, that cost people things they didn't want to give, that the season 2 or season 5 version of her, Herschel's daughter, might not have been able to make without flinching. But watch how she makes them. There is no coldness in Maggie, no emotional distance, no performance of detachment. She is, in the moments that cost the most visibly present to the weight of what she's doing. She grieves her decisions, she carries them forward. The ruthlessness of ETA, if that's the right word for it, and I'm less sure it is, comes from love. From the specific, urgent, non-negotiable love of someone who has lost Glenn and her father and everything she thought she knew about the world she was building toward, and is not willing to lose anything else. That is a different thing from Negan, a different thing from the governor, a fundamentally different thing from Alpha. What those characters share, the ones the show ultimately destroys, diminishes, or refuses a grant full redemption, is a kind of emptiness at the centre of the ruthlessness. They act without feeling, or have learned to, or have decided that feeling is too expensive to carry into the field. The governor's violence is organised around grief, yes, but grief turned inward and rotten, feeding a darkness rather than protecting anything real. Alpha has systematically removed herself from human attachment as a survival strategy. The show is unambiguous that this, specifically, is what makes her monstrous. Not the violence, the removal. The ones who survive, Daryl, Michonne, Carol, Maggie, are ruthless in ways that remain tethered to something outside themselves. To loyalty, to love, to the specific, named, irreplaceable people whose continued existence justifies whatever it costs to keep them alive. So perhaps the thesis isn't that the world rewards ruthlessness after all. Perhaps it's that the world destroys mercy without conviction, the mercy that's really just hope, or the inability to face hard truths, or a deep and human terror of what you'd have to become if you accepted what the world is actually asking. Herschel had conviction. He knew what he was choosing and why, and he chose it with full awareness of the cost. He wasn't naive. He wasn't helpless. He was a man who looked at his own philosophy with clear eyes and decided it was worth the price. And Dale, although sweet, genuine, deeply moral Dale, might have been the version without quite enough conviction, who needed the world to meet him halfway, who made the argument for mercy without being fully able to accept that the world he was arguing to had already stopped listening. If this is right, if conviction is the variable, not ruthlessness, then everything we've traced tonight shifts slightly. Shane was right about what the world required, but wrong about what he was willing to become to serve it. A man who could sacrifice others for survival, but had decided implicitly that surviving without connection was sufficient. Carol's arc isn't a tragedy of lost innocence, but a story of found clarity. A woman who understood, at every stage, exactly what she was choosing and what it cost, and who kept making the choice anyway, in service of the people behind her. And Negan is the cautionary tale, not because he's ruthless, but because he was ruthless for something hollow, for control, for performance, for the substitute for grief that power sometimes becomes when you refuse to feel the actual grief. The show is not a nihilist argument, it's a heartbroken one. We're back where we started, a weapon in someone's hand, a moment before the decision, the world watching to see which way it falls. I've spent this whole video in the archive, tracing the thread from Shane's calculations in a high school hallway to Daryl's instincts on a French roadside, from Carol's terrible clarity in the prison's tombs to Herschel's steady presence in a ward full of dying people, trying to understand what this show believes, what it's been building toward, whether the ruthless are rewarded because the show endorses ruthlessness, or because it's asking us to feel the cost of a world where that appears to be true. And I haven't resolved it. I don't think I can, and I'm increasingly convinced that's the point. The ambiguity isn't a failure of the analysis. It's the most honest thing about the show itself. It keeps asking the question it doesn't know the answer, or it knows that the answer changes depending on who's holding the weapon and why, and that the why is the whole story. Here's what the archive has given me after all of it. The weapon is not the point. The lowered weapon is not the point. What's underneath the choice? What's driving the hand that holds it or releases it? That's where the show keeps returning, season after season, with the patience of something that genuinely doesn't know where the argument lands. The characters who survive are the ones who chose their ruthlessness rather than stumbled into it, who understood the transaction they were entering, who didn't look away from what they were becoming, but faced it with open eyes and decided it was worth becoming for the sake of the people behind them. Carol, Michonne, Daryl still moving, still choosing, Maggie carrying her father's watch and her husband's name into a world that neither of them lived to see. And the characters who don't survive, Dale, Beth, Tyrese, Herschel, aren't lost because they were wrong. They're lost because the world the show built doesn't have room for being right about mercy in the wrong moment, with the wrong preparation, without the full weight of clear-eyed conviction behind it. That's a heartbreaking argument, not a nihilistic one. The show grieves them too much, mourns them too loudly, carries their names forward in too many subsequent scenes for nihilism. It knows what it's losing. It just can't find a way to save it. Carol is still out there. Daryl is moving through France with that specific practiced readiness and something warm underneath it that hasn't gone out. Maggie is building something in the ruins of what she lost. Michonne found Rick, and whatever that reunion means, whatever the two of them make of what they've both become, it means the search was worth the cost. That love survived the method. That the weapon, held for years in service of something real, didn't hollow out the person holding it. Maybe that's the most careful argument the show ever makes. Not that ruthlessness is right, not that mercy is wrong, but that what you're ruthless for, what you lower the weapon for, and what you raise it for, is the thing that determines whether any of it means anything at all. The lowered weapon is still mid-air. In the franchise, in every new episode and spin-off that picks up the question, again in a new voice, with new people and new stakes. It hasn't landed. The choice is still being made, still being written, still being offered to whoever's watching in the dark, with the phone glow and the quiet and the genuine, unresolved care for people who don't exist but somehow still matter. And what does it say about us that we keep watching to find out? Maybe that's the question the archive was always leading toward. Not a thesis about ruthlessness or mercy or survival, just the fact of us, here, at whatever hour this is, following the thread, watching the weapon, waiting to see. The show put it in someone's hand. It always does. And then it waits, patient as a good story can be, for you to decide what you believe about the person holding it, and why, and what that costs them, and whether it was worth it, and whether you'd have done the same. The weapon is still there, still somewhere between raised and lowered, between the choice and its consequence. What it means depends entirely on why they're holding it, and maybe, just maybe, on why you kept watching to find out. If you made it till the end, thank you for staying, and I hope I helped you in relaxing and unwinding before you go sleep. If you haven't already fell asleep, that is ha. Do consider supporting my work by leaving a like and subscribing, as it motivates me to produce more content for you guys. Till next time.